I got the opportunity to meet today's guest, Jillian, because we've already recorded uh, my opportunity to be on your show. And so it'll be fun to return the favor and welcome to Sexy Marriage Radio, Julian.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
And so I'm trying to capture, I mean, you do a lot of coaching and a lot of like life development planning, you probably have a real succinct way you put this, but I love it because what I've come across with you is it's not a normal thought process that when you actually are exposed to it, it becomes a, well, no duh thought process. So, how did you get into this with just kind of helping people with mini retirements or the idea of utilizing resources in a different way that actually fits a story so much better that I think a lot of people are longing?
Yeah, it started because that was kind of our game plan. Like we didn't expect to be able to retire early. So instead we retired often with mini retirements and sabbaticals. And we had taken, probably 6 or 8 before I started creating content online 8 years ago. And I
Okay.
started writing kind of about personal finance, but really about intentional living, kind of in the spot of I figured out my budgeting, I figured out my money stuff. Now, like, how do I really leverage it to make my life better? And in the course of writing about this and sharing about our mini retirements, I started helping other people do that because I was really familiar with it. It made a lot of sense to me. I had done it a lot of times, and everyone else was like, I don't know anyone who's done this. And so my coaching kind of over the last 8 years has veered more and more in that direction.
Okay. And that's what's so great because, we connected via a mutual friend that listens to both of us. So it's kind of fun to
Mm-hmm.
how connections lead to connections. And there's such an overlap because we personally had the opportunity in our family we didn't do the mini retirements. We did month-long trips for 5 years when the kids were little until they hit high school. And then schedules can just take a different priority because the kids got more required of them, etc. But I am curious, Jillian, you kind of fell into this because it started to make sense. You're saying we're like, we can't just retire early. So how do we start capturing it? And I love the framework of intentional living, but I'm curious now that you guys, when you first came up on the idea and started really kicking it around between you and your husband, what were some of the, probably looking back at it, normal, natural reservations, certainties,
Yeah.
fears surrounding it?
Yeah, my husband definitely had all of them. So this was a conversation we started the first year we were married. We were both still in college. I was taking an Old Testament class and reading, so I had to read through the entire Old Testament. And I came across, Old Testament like sabbatical. And so I'm talking to my husband, we're driving down the road, and I'm like, hey, so like there was this thing where people would take a year off every 7 years. And I think that sounds amazing. I think we should do that. And my husband's like, I don't know if people do that anymore. And I was like, but it could be so cool. And he's like, I don't actually know if they even did that back then. Like, I think it was one of those cool ideas that like was never really implemented.
Okay.
And he had all of the typical questions like, how are we going to save for this? How are we going to afford this? How is this going to impact our work? What about healthcare? And just the fact that no one does it. Like, it's just going to be a really strange thing. But I had this vision of like, but think of all the cool things we could do. We could do these adventures, all of these values that we had. This could give them a space for us to really
Hmm.
live those out. And so we kind of just tucked that in. And then as the opportunities arose, we kind of leaned in.
Okay. And so when you talk about the opportunities arose, is that something that circumstances kind of aligned? You started working towards an intention. I'm curious how it played out with you. I'm happy to share how Pam and I's equivalent sort of journey, but I'm curious, how did it evolve then? If you plant this thing out there where he's like, yeah, hold on a second. I'm not so sure, but what made it go from there to actually let's do it?
So I think there's kind of 3 main ways that people get into a mini retirement or sabbatical. Like either you take a gap in between your jobs, you
Hmm.
negotiate the time off with your current employer, or life hands you a difficult, unique situation and you have the opportunity to step away or step back from your
Hmm.
career for a moment. And all three happened to us. The very
Okay.
first one, my employer actually offered to give me a month off because I had had a miscarriage, where for a lot of people, a miscarriage is like a little blip and it's sad and they like go on with their lives. It unlocked a lifetime of
Mm,
like repressed trauma that I had very effectively pushed down. And all of a
okay.
sudden, like the dam broke and I was a mess. And they were
Okay.
like, please leave. Please leave for a
Yeah.
month, go figure out your crap, and then come back when you're better. And so my best friend and I, we got in my Honda Civic and we drove from DC to Seattle and back. We camped in our car and in tents and on people's couches, and it was amazing. And it was exactly what I needed because I had never actually given myself space to
Yeah.
like feel my feelings.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I never felt like I had time or, the bandwidth to feel feelings. And I had this month. So we had that. I got laid off at one point and we kind of took that opportunity and, went and did some cool things. Then between jobs, we took some time when my husband left the military. He took about 6 months and we ended up using that to buy and renovate two houses.
Okay. No, I mean that makes such sense because there is an element where you get these opportunities. You know, we had a similar in the sense that where we started our change and transition to month-long adventures when the kids were little. It aligned with Pam shifting from one job at a bank to another at a tax firm. So that meant the summer was all of a sudden less of the focus because of the two major tax seasons, spring and fall. And so she just basically told the guy, I'm coming, but I want a whole month off every summer. And that allowed us to just, here we go, let's start exploring it and
Hmm.
let's figure out what this looks like, which is still kind of stress inducing because when you look at that huge unknown, it's like, I don't know what to do with it. But when you started
Yes.
doing it as a family and as a married couple, what did you start noticing about the dynamics between you?
Yeah, I always tell people like confidence and clarity come in doing. So it is hard and stressful and like you're adding a lot to your plate by doing
Hmm.
this, but just like in your guys' story, like the more you do it, like the more you see the benefit and the better it gets, like the easier it gets. And for us, especially traveling, we have 5 kids. We travel in a camper. Traveling with 5 kids is harder than being at home. It just is. The
Yes.
logistics are harder, like the discipline, the organization, the planning, all of it's harder. Getting their clothes clean is harder, like all of it's harder. But it gives us like a really positive challenge to work together, not just as a couple, but as a family. Because as a family, if there's some dysfunction, all of that comes to the surface while we're traveling.
Yeah.
Anything
Yeah.
that's broken in our family dynamic gets amplified. So definitely like it's like a positive challenge for us as a family, but also, and I've been feeling this a lot lately, being able to look back on those really positive, interesting, important experiences now that we're going through some challenges is like, I'm so glad we did that. Like, I'm so
Right.
glad we made that investment because now, when things are hard or confusing, we kind of like, it's like having put money in the bank. Like, we've really
Hmm.
invested in these relationships and now,
Hmm.
we can kind of live off the interest for a while.
No, and I think that's a huge point because there's an element of what my guess is because I would have fallen victim to this as well at stages and could even still of, you know what, just the thought of doing that and the logistics involved and the extra stress, and it's been tense at home anyway, and there's more and more involved that it would make it to where it's just I can talk myself out of it rather than when you do it, you recognize, wait, I think of it, tell me if I'm off in the way you think of this, Jillian. I think of it as I'm just, which stress do I want? I just choose one of them. One's out more towards adventurous and out in the world or in intentionally living better, and one's just following a status quo that is a should a lot of the time. And if I look at it that way, then it starts to be, well, I need to do the hard thing. I need to lean into something. I need to stretch and grow because that's where you get that dividend at the end.
Yeah, there's definitely like a monotonous stress of our life or like a growth
Absolutely.
stress.
Yeah.
Um, but I also encourage people, in kind of when I'm coaching people, the first step is figuring out your intention. Like, what's the thing you need in your life the most right now? Like, what's the most important right now? What's been missing the most that you should focus on, and not trying to do like 10 different intentions. Really
Yeah.
optimize for one or two. So if you're massively burned out, maybe not like an around the world trip. I had someone on my podcast who was super burned out, but they wanted to travel and they wanted like quality time. So optimizing that travel for rest. And she was like, you know what? We booked a house on a lake for a month and we just hung out and I went running every day and the kids played in the lake, really figuring out what you need and making sure your time off actually supports that thing.
Yeah. I think that's a great distinction because a lot of times, tell me if you hear this with people that you work with or talk through, because there's a difference between taking a sabbatical or these mini retirements. It's not 6 month vacation necessarily because I think vacation connotation is I go someplace beautiful, it's all inclusive. It's
Yeah.
because the human nature to me is I still got to do something. I still have to be productive with my time. I need to volunteer doing something or work on something, not just sit on a beach for a year. As much as that sounds fantastic, I think I would go crazy in short process because I wouldn't have a meaning for the day.
Yeah. Yeah. I encourage people when you kind of figure out that intention, let's say you pick three, set it up as phases. So a lot of Americans are super burned out. So phase one might be recovering from burnout. Phase two might be epic adventure. And phase three might be something more personal growth. Maybe you want to like try to start a business or take classes or think about a career pivot or, really build out a hobby or start volunteering. You know, it might not make sense to like extensive travel and recover from burnout and start a business all at the same time, but you can have those three intentions if you just do them in different phases.
Right.
And once you kind of feel like, if you're burned out and you're like, I actually, the beach sounds amazing. You might start there and slowly check in with yourself at week 2, at week 3, at week 4. How are you feeling and when are you ready to kind of transition to that next phase?
Yeah, because it's so tell me this. This is what pops into my head because man, when I left the ministry, which was in 1998, so right at the end, no, yeah, that's right. I don't, either way, doesn't matter. That there was I had just gotten into backpacking and just heading out with friends, or I went out once by myself. But what I recognized is when I was out in nature, I needed like a good solid 2 days before I actually kind of slowed down, felt a little more in tune with that rhythm. Um, and even then, sometimes it wasn't enough. I remember one trip we went on, it was a 5 day backpacking trip when it was five of us guys. And there were two guys that on day five, when we're hiking out, they're like, I'm so ready to leave. And I'm like, I just got comfortable
Yeah.
out here in the slow. There's nothing really required other than I got to make sure I got clean water and I got shelter
Mhm.
and a fire at night because we're in Colorado. You know, so it's just there's this element of I need that margin, and then you're talking about now how do I look at what I need to tend to in the deeper
Yeah.
parts of me, right?
Yeah. A pattern I notice for most people is that their stress, whether that's cortisol or adrenaline or just being in a heightened state, whatever's happening in their body has a half life. It does not, the moment you walk out of your office, your whole system does not recalibrate. It
Right.
takes some time. And depending how high strung people have been for how long, like, what's your heart rate at? What's your blood pressure at? Like, if you've been dysregulated up for a long time, it's going to take some time for your body to kind of recalibrate. And
Hmm.
that's why I recommend a mini retirement. Like, in my definition, it's a month or longer
Okay.
because it usually takes people more than 4 days, more than a week. For people who are kind of moderately burned out, it's somewhere around like end of week 1, week 2, week 3. They really feel their body sink in to this more restful state. And it's kind of like, I kind of compare it to fasting. When you're not eating, you don't feel massively hungry all the time. You're not constantly like inundated with hunger cues. You feel massively hungry as soon as your body realizes it has access to food again and you start eating. And then you're hungry for a long time. Your body will stay hungry until it feels like it's replenished. And the same thing is true of rest. You could be massively tired, but you won't necessarily feel massively tired
Right.
all of the time until you start to rest. And then you will feel tired until your body has kind of come up to its baseline again.
Yeah. And so do you think from your experience, and I'm real curious about relationally,
Mhm.
like maritally,
Yeah.
would you see the same thing happening in that relationship dynamic?
How so?
That you could get so caught up, and I just think of I'll use Pam and I as an example because we got two different careers. We overlap a
Mhm.
lot because we do a podcast together. We do stuff at church together. We raise kids together, but we also have our own things. And so there's an element of relational stress. But
Mhm.
like I was gone all last week while we're recording this, and it just so happened our oldest is not home from college yet for summer, and our youngest had plans all day. He had things going on, so he was out. So we had that full day. And at the end of the day, we actually looked at each other and went, that was real restorative in a lot of ways
Yeah.
because it was just us with no, we did have plans and they
Mhm.
fell through. And so we found ourselves with, well, how do you want to spend this time? Kind of a thing,
Yeah.
right? And it became,
Yeah.
I just see that same kind of system at play in us personally also has some
Mhm.
overlap relationally,
Yeah.
that I get a chance
Yeah.
to actually see and deal with what's going on between us differently because I don't have the other stresses bombarding us.
Yeah, there's definitely kind of a logistical load, I think, for a lot of married couples, especially if you have kids. There have been
Hmm.
seasons in our marriage that I feel like all of our conversation is just to maintain like the to do discuss pile. And we never get to the bottom of it. And it takes a while to work through all of that, like, so this is what's going on with this person, and this is what this teacher's saying, and these are the appointments that are coming up, and did you make sure you picked up that thing, and we really need to take care of this repair, um, before you get to more interesting conversation, before you get to more meaningful conversation, and before you can kind of relax and enjoy the adventure or the curiosity. It's tough to be curious when you're exhausted. One of the things we love doing when we travel is we have like all these different museum membership passes. So we go to tons of different like
Okay.
science museums and history museums. And for a year, we got really into planetariums. We went to a whole bunch of planetariums, but it was really fun to. I don't know if I remembered any of this from school. So it was really fun to kind of learn all of this together with our kids, but
Hmm.
also with each other. And we started like asking all of these science questions while we would go for walks and Googling all these things. To pretty soon, all of our Google News feed was like different develops that are happening in like space science. But it had been a long time since we like were curious together
Yeah.
and learning things that we didn't have to learn. It wasn't home repair, it wasn't cooking, it wasn't parenting, it was just an extra joy that felt
Right.
frivolous.
Yeah. It was. Well, I hear it is. It's that it's relational exploration while you're
Yeah.
going through it personally, and you discover the likeness, the aligning, the undercurrent of those are the things to me that kind of draw us together in the first place. Is there some sort of energy and synergy there that now all of a sudden we have just packed down to the bottom because of all the other roles, responsibilities, stressors, tensions, everything. That's the beauty of what you're describing to me on a relational level is if I can get away from the immediate, I have the important there, hopefully.
Yeah. I love gardening, so I have like a lot of gardening analogies. But one of my favorites is like if you think about a raised container, like a 4x4 box, you have so many plants in there. Um, and it's finite. It's limited. The amount of sunshine, the amount of water, the amount of nutrients, the amount of space. Sometimes our work plant can get so big that it kind of crowds out the other plants. It kind of becomes invasive. I love mint. It takes over a space.
Yes.
And you can only really help the other plants thrive by either pruning it back hard or removing it for a season and
Okay.
letting the other things in your life, the other relationships, have a chance to thrive, give them more access to the sun and the water and the nutrients. And then hopefully when you put like that work plant back in, you can keep it contained in a way that everything else can still thrive.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of what you're trying to help people find is it's the how do I get the break to restore, to find a different value, to be more intentional, to let what's underneath this all usually come back up to be in the driver's seat or the head of the board table, right? In the boardroom, that I can let that be my motivator rather than no, this is the script I've got to follow. This is what they say. This is because it's so easy to just have all that happen, and then the lifetime. This is where Pam and I have been. We are seeing more and more now that we're in our 50s, seeing more and more. If we wait till we can quote unquote retire at the retirement age, physically speaking, can we do some of the things we really want to do at that point?
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
got to start thinking about that because it's around the corner. And so how are we shifting and adjusting for now?
There are things in our lives with expiration dates, and they
Mm-hmm.
just don't have a long shelf life, whether that's when our kids are younger or when we're in good health or our physical capabilities or the age of our parents. You know, if you wait 30 years, you and your dad might not be backpacking through Ireland. It's expired. That opportunity passed you by. And that's one of the challenges with a typical retirement age is you're hoping that all of these things don't expire and you can shove them all into the end of your life. But I had this moment, we did a 10-week road trip with our kids maybe 6 years ago. They were all itsy bitsy. We were in a pop-up camper. We did 10 national parks. It was super fun. But I remember by the time we got to like Yosemite thinking, this might be the last time we can do this trip. This trip has a strong expiration date. In 10 or 15 years, when all my kids are in their 20s, they're not going to be doing 10 weeks in a pop up camper with us in national parks. Like the ship will have sailed.
Right.
And for sure, there'll be other cool things we can do with our kids when they're in their 20s, but not this. And
Right.
so, if there's things that like you really care about and have an expiration date, carve out a month, carve out 2 months, negotiate it from your employer, take it in between jobs, whatever you need to do, because I guarantee at 65, when you look back,
Yeah.
those will be the highlights of your life.
Yeah. No, that's so, so true. I love that phrase to end it there on things that we have in life have shelf lives. And that's an important factor. No matter how much we want to act like that is not a truth, it
Yeah.
absolutely is. So,
Yeah.
Jillian, how can people find more of you and the work and the framework you help do?
Yeah, I'm at retireoften.com, and that's the name of my podcast if you want to hear other people's mini retirement stories. On social media, I'm Julian Johnsrud across the board. Um, and I have some free worksheets if you do retireoften.com/mini. A few of those like life planning, what would we spend the time on, kind of helping you pick
Hmm.
what would be the focus of it.
That's so great. Well, Jillian, thank you so much. I'm so glad we got connected because
Yeah, me
it's been
too.
fun to hear your framework and to collaborate thus far. So all the best.
Thank you.